Okay, good evening, everybody. Good evening. My name is Gene Claridge. I'm the president of the Cleveland Civil Roundtable. It is truly an honor to be here tonight as we officially kick off the U.S. Grant Cleveland campaign, a week-long celebration marking the 160th anniversary of the end of the American Civil War. This event is an incredible opportunity to engage with one of the most significant figures in American history, General and President Ulysses S. Grant, and to gain deeper understanding of his pivotal role in shaping the future of our nation. Before we get started, I want to share some information about the Grant campaign and why we're doing it. So we'll start with the why. So why? General Grant is often a misunderstood and overlooked figure in American history, too often relegated to the shadows when discussing the giants of our past. But the truth is, U.S. Grant is a forgotten hero of the Republic, a man whose leadership in the Civil War and during Reconstruction deserves to be celebrated alongside the likes of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. His perseverance, his vision, and his dedication to preserving the Union have shaped the course of our history in ways that we must not forget. Tonight, we have the rare opportunity to reflect on his legacy and give him the recognition he truly deserves. We are especially fortunate to have with us Dr. Curt Fields, the premier living historian who portrays General Grant. Dr. Fields has portrayed Grant in 22 plus states. And he's also been in a number of Civil War anniversary events, including the 150th as well as 160th observations of Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Vicksburg, and most recently Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. His portrayal of Grant is not just a reenactment, it is an authentic living connection to the past, and we are incredibly privileged to have him with us this evening. So what makes this opportunity so special is the collaboration with so many organizations and local institutions coming together to bring this history to life. We owe a debt of gratitude to our partners who have worked tirelessly to make this event possible. The Cleveland Civil Roundtable, Westlake Porter and Lorain County Libraries, the Western Reserve Historical Society, and the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museum. It is thanks to the support of these venues that we can engage with Dr. Fields as portrayal of General U.S. Grant in meaningful ways and locations across Northeast Ohio. Throughout the week, folks will have opportunity to experience this living history at several remarkable venues, including here tonight, Westlake Porter Library, tomorrow at Lorain County Library, at Wednesday at the Cleveland Civil Roundtable meeting, on Thursday at the Cleveland History Center, and last but certainly not least, the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museum. In addition to these awesome evening events, one of the most exciting aspects of this week is the chance to bring U.S. Grant in front of local students. Dr. Fields will visit 5 middle schools across the area as well as some high schools, including Fremont Middle School, Langston Middle School, Lee Bernston Middle School, Lutheran West High School, and Strongsville Middle School. These presentations will engage over 1,000 students, offering them a first-hand experience that will undoubtedly leave a lasting impression on the next generation of historians, leaders, and citizens. All in all, this week would not be possible without the dedication of these incredible organizations and their commitment to preserving and sharing the vital history of our shared American public. I'd like to thank 2 individuals here and give some shout-outs. First and foremost, back in the room, Steve Pettyjohn. He's our Grant campaign coordinator. I'm going to use a little Civil War humor. The way that John Rollins is to U.S. Grant is Steve Pettyjohn to Dr. Fields on this trip. I'd also like to thank Andrew Mangles, the director of Westlake Porter Library, for his efforts and for his generously hosting tonight's kickoff meeting, as well as his wonderful team that's helping out tonight. So finally, as we prepare for this week of living history, I encourage all of you to take full advantage of the opportunities to hear from Dr. Fields, but also learn from each other. This is a rare chance to connect with America's most important historical figures in a way that is both educational as well as inspiring. Now, without further ado, let me invite my colleague, Andrew, to the podium.
Thank you, Gene. All right. Thank you very much. I'm Andrew Mangles, director of Westlake Porter Public Library. And I did also want to thank Steve Pettyjohn. He's an amazing guy who put a lot of work into this. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight for this very exciting presentation. And if you'll indulge me on one more thank you, I would be remiss without mentioning that this program is possible because of the generous underwriting by the Friends of Porter Public Library. For over 50 years, the Friends have been raising money so the library can put on quality programs like this, as well as our summer reading program for all ages that will kick off in just a few weeks. Friends membership forms are on the back table if you are interested in supporting this important and venerable organization. Our speaker this evening is the eminently qualified speaker, Dr. Curt Fields. Dr. Fields received a bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Memphis and a master's and PhD degrees from Michigan State University. He's a career educator, having taught for 8 years at the junior and senior high school levels and served 25 years as a high school administrator before retiring. In addition to that, he found time somehow to also serve as a Memphis, Tennessee police officer and was an MPD hostage negotiator and received the life-saving medal from the city of Memphis for actions in the line of duty. Amazing. Dr. Fields researches and reads extensively about General Grant to deliver an accurate persona of the general. His presentations are first person, quoting from General Grant's memoirs, articles, and letters the general wrote, statements he made in interviews or wrote himself, and first person accounts of people who knew the general or were with him and witnessed him during these events. I'm personally interested, will be interested to hear what thoughts, if any, President and General Grant may have about my hometown of St. Louis, Missouri, and his 5+ years there, though I was a North Sider and he was a South Sider, and he was also there 120 years before I came around. So lastly, and just a quick promo and a token of our appreciation, one of the things that we do here at Porter Library, we've been doing for 3 years, is a monthly program called the World at War Forum, where we delve into topics and historical topics around World War I, World War II, Korea, all over the map. It's been a very successful program, and as part of that, we give each speaker a mug. And so while this is a completely different time period, as our logo really represents more World War II, it is still the World at War Forum mug that we give our speakers. So this will be a token of our appreciation to you this evening. So thank you. And lastly, don't forget to fill out your program evaluation form. And with that, I give you General of the Army of the United States and U.S. President Ulysses S. Grant.
Thank you. I suspect after all of that, you expect I'm going to say great things. I expect I will not. I too want to thank the Cleveland Civil War Roundtable and Steve Pettyjohn specifically for everything that they and he have done. I couldn't have a better aide-de-camp. I'm going to give him a field promotion to colonel on my staff. I need people who can work as diligently and thoroughly as he. I also would like to have this couple stand. We've got 2 people from your own community who have seen fit to dress and grace me and honor me by going to that trouble. They're correctly period dressed, and I want you to thank them and honor them. And something else I'd like to tell you, if I'm ever fortunate enough to stand before you again, or in any gathering that we may come together, please, if you have period dress, uniforms, Confederate, Federal, or period dress, please come wearing your period attire. The more, the better. I am no star, and I like as many folks around me as possible who are correctly and period dressed. Do we have that understanding? Yes. Very good. I am charged this night with talking about the war and shortly thereafter. But first I will tell you that Julia is not here tonight. And the last thing that she told me before I got on the cars to come here was, Liz, when you get in front of those folks, stand up straight. And I said, well, as much as I can, I will. And she said, and for whatever you do, Liz, keep your hands out of your pockets. In fact, I understand there are even 2 statues of me with my hands in my pockets. And most of the time, I have my hands in my pockets. I'm the most unmilitary military figure in American history. There is much that I would like to tell you about that. I did have what I will do to digress a bit from Appomattox. One lady who came in very graciously said, did General Grant have a Southern accent? And I said, well, yes, he did. Now keep in mind, if you folks go any further north, you're in Lake Erie. I grew up in Georgetown, Ohio, which is about 10 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line, the Ohio River. If you draw a line across to the Atlantic coast from Georgetown, Richmond, Virginia is just a little bit further south than Georgetown. And Georgetown was founded in 1820-21 by a contingent of folks who lived in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. They wanted to live in a free state, so they moved across the Ohio River, and in those days, most of the time, you could ride a horse across the Ohio River there at Ripley and Maysville. I understand it's different now, but you could at that time. So Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia migrated across the Ohio, go 10 miles inland, and set up a town. And then as I grew up, till I was 17 and left to go to the academy, which I did not want to do, but that's another story. I went to school for a year in Maysville, Kentucky, and for almost a year there in Ripley, right across from Maysville. I was frequently making trips for my father as far south as Louisville, Kentucky, frequently. So growing up in that environment, I come across the intonations and inflections of my voice quite naturally. In fact, one of my earliest biographers, I think in 66, 67, said General Grant has the inflections and intonations, yes, even the manners and gestures of a man of the South. And the people, if you go down to Brown County down there, if you go any further, you're going to fall in the Ohio River. You'll hear people speaking much like I do. So that's why I sound like I do, because I spent most of my life around people in the South. Now, having addressed that, I do want to talk about weightier matters, about Appomattox and the surrender. We left Petersburg on April the 2nd of 65. For almost 11 months, we'd been encircling Lee, and I was sidling all the way, all the time, sidling down to the south and the southwest, south and southwest, because I was trying to encircle Petersburg. Now, coming into Petersburg, there are 4 railroads. One of them that comes as far south as south central Mississippi, because Lee was getting a lot of his food for the Army of Northern Virginia from the prairies of central and south central Mississippi, as well as the Shenandoah Valley. But by the time we had gotten to March and April of 65, I had stopped all of that, stopped the food and stopped the recruits out of the Shenandoah Valley. But as I was sidling, my troops think that they say things about me, the rumors around camp, that they think I don't hear what they say, but everything comes under my tent fly. I hear it all. And one of them is, my soldiers like to say, General Grant would flank the devil out of hell. And I intended to, if that was necessary, to go around and cut off the 4 railroads going into Petersburg, because when I cut off the railroads, Lee would not be able to feed his troops, what little he was feeding them by that time. We cut those lines on April the 1st, and Lee had to evacuate. Now, I met with President Lincoln April the 2nd on the front porch of some Confederate attorney's home. I understand it is still there. And we talked for a bit about what was going to happen. I told the president at that time it was probably going to take, it could take several months to bring Lee to bay. It might be as little as a few weeks. I couldn't tell. And the Army of the Potomac was about 50,000 men left. The Army of the James, which had been over around Petersburg under Ben Butler, Spoon's Butler, he hates it when I call him that, but I had already sacked him and replaced him with Ord, EOC Ord. They had gotten south of Lee and gotten to the west of him. So the armies are moving. I've got nearly 75,000 troops moving. Lee left Petersburg with about 50,000. He left the lines. We had 35 miles of trenches. And for almost 10 months, those Confederate soldiers had been in those trenches, and they couldn't stand up any higher than this. So when they got out of the trenches and they could finally stand up without taking a ball through the head, they were really happy. But he had left with about 50,000. I had about 75,000 total with the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James, and they're all in pursuit of Lee. So on the afternoon of the 2nd of April, the President and I were talking, and he asked me, how long do you think it'll, and I won't affect it much, but I will tell you, President Lincoln had kind of a high voice, and he kind of talked like this. He didn't like to make much public talking. He didn't speak in public too much if he could avoid it, and almost an irritating voice. And he was a really ugly man. Troops describe him as being very ugly, and of course he's fond of saying, of course he hears everything too, and he was fond of saying people had called him two-faced. And one lady had the nerve to tell him to his face, "You're just two-faced." And he said, "Ma'am, if you think I had another face, would I use this one?" So President Lincoln was well aware of his homeliness, but I asked him before I left, "Is there anything that you would have me know, Mr. President? What do you want me to do to keep in mind as I pursue Lee? Because Lee can't keep this up much longer." And the President said, "Well, when you do find him, let him up easy. Just let him up easy. I want those men back home on their farms. I want them back home working. Send them home. Let them up easy, General." And I said, "I can do that." And then I said, "I must needs be on my way. The Army is moving quickly, and I am their leader, and I must be in front of them." So Sheridan, Phil Sheridan, Little Phil, he hates it when I call him that. He's 5'4" on a good day with his cavalry boots on. But Phil and General E.O.C. Ord, Edward Otha Cresap Ord, are in the Army of the James, and I said, they've gone south of Lee and have gone faster than Lee because Lee's trying to feed his army, and got in front of Lee. So over the next 7 days, we pursued Lee. Now, a key feature for you that I'd like you to remember, there will be no examination, but remember this: when we left Petersburg, I had ordered 7 days rations for all the troopers, and 3 days cooked rations in their haversacks. So that's 3 days of food that they can sit down, heat it up over a fire and eat it. And then there's 7 days that they'll have to prepare some food. So we had 7 days of food on our persons, and each man was carrying 50 rounds of ammunition. In those next 7 days, I saw something that I'd never seen in my Army career. All through the Mexican War and all through 4 years of this war, I'd never seen what I saw then. There were no shirkers. There was no one dragging behind. There were no men on the side of the road with their brogans off, rubbing their feet. Nobody was asleep over next to a fence. Nobody was in an orchard getting some of that fruit. Everybody was there and in pursuit of Lee. We were almost at a trot. There were no shirkers, no stragglers, because while no man wanted to be killed, no man wanted to be the last man killed. No man wanted to miss the end, because all 75,000 of those Federal soldiers knew the end is near. We've almost got him, and I'm not going to miss that. So as we moved across Virginia to the west, on April the 5th, I got a note from Phil Sheridan, the evening of April the 5th, and he said, "I wish you were here with me." Now, he's the commander of the Army of the Shenandoah, which is 12,500 cavalry. and he's with the Army of the James under General Ord. Well, they had gotten in front of Lee. And as Lee is stopping and trying to feed his men, he's lost. He got a day's march on me on the 2nd. When he left Petersburg and slipped out, he got a day's march, but he gave that day up. I give General Lee credit because he stopped that second day out, and he went from being General Lee, the military genius that he was, to General Lee, the humanitarian, because he stopped to try to feed his men. Every time, well, he got a train load of supplies, but it was ammunition. He's expecting a train load of food, cars of food. You can't eat ammunition. And at the Dinwiddie Courthouse, he had stopped. He gave up that day's lead on me to try to feed his men, but he was not successful. There was no food to be had. The ground had been fought over for 4 years, and the people living there were starving. They had no food for Lee's army, so he had to move again. He's having to move constantly as men are dropping on the side of the road from exhaustion. He's also having to take about 400 wagons full of Confederate government paperwork that Davis had put in wagons and sent with the Army of Northern Virginia, while he and the Confederate Congress fled south because he wanted to go to Cuba and then go over to England and maintain the war from exile. So Lee is really bogged down, and that 8-hour lead he's got on me collapses. On the 5th, though, the evening of the 5th, Sheridan sent me a note and said, "I wish you were here with me." Well, that's all it took, because I've been with the Army of the Potomac. Now, here I can clarify something for you. I'm criticized because I did not have General Meade at the Wilmer McLean home when Lee surrendered to me, that I snubbed Meade. I did not. Meade had gotten sick, he had dysentery, and in fact was so ill he was riding in an Army ambulance and couldn't sit his horse. And we were moving more slowly than was the Army of the James. And I knew that Sheridan was going to spark a fight. So at about 8 o'clock in the evening on April the 5th, I got with my staff of about 12 people, and we began riding through the evening. Now, my staff was pretty touchy about that, because if you'll think, Stonewall Jackson was killed at night by his own men, and James Longstreet, one of my best friends, was shot during the day or in the early evening by his own men. And here we are with 50,000 rebels and 75,000 Federals, and we're riding, a party of horsemen riding through the night through the forest. That's a prime situation to get shot. But we went anyway, and I got with Sheridan at about 10:30 that night, and I stayed with him for what it turned out to be the next 4 days. And something else I want to point out to you as I go, I've been in the saddle on the run since April the 2nd. I haven't bathed since April the 2nd. Now you might think, why is he telling us that? Well, because it goes to, in just a few minutes, to what I was wearing when I met General Lee. So I'm dressed up in my frock coat tonight. Usually I have a private sack coat. It's a contract government issue coat, 4 buttons, no pockets. Officers' sack coat, now they've got to have something different. Officers have 5 buttons, and it's a little bit longer. It's got pockets and the velvet cuffs and the velvet collars. I care not for those trappings. Give me something simple and comfortable, so I wear a private's blouse with only shoulder straps to indicate my rank to the Army, as if anybody needs to know what my rank is. So that's what I was wearing. And we haven't taken time. There's been no situation where we could bathe. So April the 2nd to April the 5th. We finally caught up with Lee and brought him to bay on the evening of April the 8th. I was going into Farmville on the 7th, Farmville, Virginia, and his rear guard was skirmishing with our advance guard. We had finally locked horns with Lee. And they had finally found a train full of food. and the soldiers were throwing crates of food off as fast as they can while our skirmishers were picket line were firing at them. And they got as much food as they could and ran across the Appomattox River where they could ford it and got away. And that night, I was told that the Battle of Sailor's Creek had happened on the 6th, the night before. Lee lost a third of his army, 9 generals, one of them his own son, captured, and about 1,500 killed and wounded. He lost a full third of his army. And one of those men that was captured, the general, was Dick Ewell. He'd been one of my commanding officers back at Jefferson Barracks back in 43 when I graduated from the academy. And Dick Ewell was captured and said, "We knew it was over when you fellas crossed the James a year before." He said, we should have surrendered while we had something to negotiate with. Now anybody who's killed, it's just nothing but murder. And when I heard that, I was brought in, a very tall, spare colonel, tall fella. Average height of a man is 5 feet 6 inches tall. I'm 5'8". But the average man's 5'6". Now a fellow that's topping 6'2" and skinny as a grasshopper is a standout. But this threadbare Confederate colonel's brought into me. Now my staff knows everybody wants to see the general, but they also know very few people need to see the general. But they know me, and they brought me this man. Now I was sitting in one of the rooms at the hospital. It was the Prince Edward Hotel, and it had been used by Lee as a hospital, field hospital. Blood and dressing and some other body parts were lying around the rooms, and it was easy to tell it was a hospital, and I was setting up my headquarters. They brought this man into me and said, "General, this colonel wants to talk to you. He wants to surrender to you." And I put down my pencil and I said, "Well, sir, what have you got to say?" And he said, "Well, General, I live here. In fact, my family built this hotel." And he had been a state legislature in the Virginia House of Burgesses before the war, well-to-do fella. He didn't look at that night. After 4 years, he'd survived 4 years. He said, "I raised a regiment here in Farmville, and I was in command of it. And as we were marching past this hotel this afternoon, I looked up here and I thought, I'm the last man in my regiment, and I'm going home." So he said, "Here I am. I'm home, and I'm surrendering to you." And I scratched my beard and thought about it, and I said, "Well, I'll tell you, Colonel." And I was thinking, that's one more regiment we don't have to fight. That's another regiment full of troops I don't have to kill. And I said, "If you will stay here and obey the laws here and promise me that you will not take up arms again against the United States of America, you will not be disturbed." And he said, "I can do that, and I will do that. You have my word." And I said, "Well, then go about your business." And I did leave orders that I had better not hear that the Prince Edward Hotel had been burned. It would go hard on some officers if that unfortunate incident should occur. Well, I said, it's time to write General Lee a letter. And at 5 o'clock on April the 7th of 1865, I sent General Lee a note saying, "I think you really ought to surrender." We exchanged 9 notes in the next 48 hours. And General Lee came to surrender, tell me at 9 o'clock in the morning on April the 9th, only after they had made one last attempt at Appomattox Courthouse, Appomattox Station, to break through federal lines, and they couldn't. Lee was trying to break south and join Joe Johnston in Benton and Raleigh, North Carolina. He could not do it, and Lee said, "Well, I've got to go see General Grant." That morning of the 9th, I had had a migraine headache all day the day before. It was the worst I'd ever had. My surgeon said, "You need to go back to Washington City." And I said, "Well, that is not going to happen." And I spent the night in a farmer's house in Curdsville. He had a double house, and I was up on the 2nd floor, and soldiers down below said they could hear me saying, "I can't stand the pain. with my hands clasped to my temples. I can't stand the pain. And they could hear me walking on the floors. I spent the night with mustard plasters on my inside of my wrists, the back of my neck, my feet in a pan of hot water, and I will tell you none of that works. Don't try mustard plasters for a headache. About 4 o'clock in the morning, I hadn't slept. I tried to, and I went outside, about 30, 33, 4 degrees. It's cold in Virginia in April. I got Tyler's grip. And called for Cincinnati. I thought maybe a ride in the cool of the morning air would clear up my headache, and it didn't. I went over to Meade's headquarters, which were a few hundred yards away from mine, had a cup of coffee, replied to the last letter from General Lee and said he wanted to meet me between the lines. I said, there's no need to meet between the lines. I've already told you I can't treat for peace. President Lincoln has told me the one job you've got is to get Lee to lay down his arms. You don't negotiate anything beyond that, nothing political. Any political matters I will hold in my hands and my hands only. So I was telling General Lee, I'm not going to negotiate for peace. I can't treat for peace. If you'll stop fighting, the war will be over. And then the men who deal with such matters will come in and negotiate. So I sent that letter. Well, he couldn't break out. John B. Gordon, General Gordon, couldn't break through our lines. And at about 9 o'clock in the morning, General Lee went out to the lines where he said he wanted to meet me. He was expecting to meet me. And he wanted to surrender. And he got the note that I just told you about. He wadded, the one time I know that Lee lost his temper, he wadded my letter up and threw it. And he hit Colonel Marshall, his aide, with it. He apologized, but he wrote another note and he said, I met you today for the purpose of surrender, the Army of the Northern Virginia. Sent a note. Now he's between the lines. Now he's looking to his east at the Army of the Potomac with about 60,000 men, and to his west, the Army of the James with another 60,000 men. And by now, 7 days later, with the battles he's fought and the desertions that he's had, because a lot of the Army of Northern Virginia, when they lived in that area, and when they got to their homes, they just walked up the lane and went home. So Lee's down to about 26,000 men, and he's in a vice grip between the two armies, the Potomac and the James. When I left, I'd been on the Farmville-Richmond Road, ran into some Confederate forces, and had to move to the Farmville-Lynchburg Road. Now, I wasn't lost, but the Army didn't know exactly where I was. Now, Lee is between the lines. The Federal Meade's Army of the Potomac has orders to attack at noon. An officer rides out, and there's Robert E. Lee under a flag of truce, the only time he was ever under a flag of truce. This officer rides out under a flag of truce, dirty rag. You know, white flags of surrender are not standard issue in the quartermaster's supplies. We don't carry them. And the only thing that we could find was a rag. And so this officer rides out with a flag of truce, and they're saying, don't shoot, don't shoot. And they got out to General Lee, and the officer rode up. Of course, I heard about this after the fact, and the officer rode up and said, General Lee, what are you doing here? And Lee said, I want to surrender. And he said, General, I'm sorry, but you've got to go because I've got orders to attack at noon, and I can't stop that. So Lee said, well, tell General Meade I'm trying to surrender. Meade was in a wagon, an ambulance, 2 miles back. Now think how long it takes to ride a horse 2 miles. Tell the message, get a reply, and ride 2 miles back. So Meade replied, he said, I don't have the authority to order any different. I can't stop the attack. So General Lee said, can you people not understand? I'm trying to end this war, and you're telling me I don't have orders to stop an attack. So he sent a message to me through Meade's Army of the Potomac. And he also, General Meade suggested, well, send a note through the Army of the James back towards Sheridan and General Ord. So they sent another messenger going that way. And they waited another hour, and they're looking at their watches and saying, time's running out. And Meade said, well, go back through the Army. We'll send an officer, a federal officer with the Confederate escort, and we'll see if we can't find General Grant. So there's federal officers with Confederate escorts going through the Army in Northern Virginia trying to find me. Now, I'm on my horse with 12 staff members, and here comes a horseman, Harry Pease. He's one of those guys that his name is slid off the pages of the history books down into the bindings. You don't know anything about Harry Pease, do you? Well, Harry doesn't deserve that anonymity. Harry's the man who brought me the message, General Lee wants to meet me to surrender. Major Pease comes riding across that field, hallooing, and he rode up to me and he gave me that message. And I had a Grimsley saddle. That was my favorite. Now, Grimsley doesn't have a saddle horn. It just comes up real high, front and back, and I can lean back on it. It's good for my back. And so I leaned over on my Grimsley saddle, and I just looked at Major Pease. And then after a few moments, he remembered himself. He remembered he's only talking to the commanding general in chief of all United States military forces, and he composed himself and he said, I've got a note for you from General Lee. So I took it, I read that about the surrender, my headache immediately went away. And I sat down on a rock there and I said, I wrote General Lee, and he had written this at 9 o'clock. It's 11:50. So I've had 3 armies looking for me, Army of Virginia, Army of the Potomac, Army of the James, all looking for me for 3 hours. And I wrote, General Lee, yours of this morning at 9 a.m. is just received. At 11:50, I gave the specific time. And I am 4 miles west of Walker's Church, which is 8 miles east of Appomattox. So I told General Lee as specifically as I could what my location was, because I knew that trading politicians who do whatever it is they do for whatever reason they do them, that somebody, everybody, anybody was going to be saying, well, Grant's off somewhere drunk. Grant, he's shirking his duties. There's no telling what would be said about me, but I gave my specific time and specific location. And I sent Orville Babcock to meet with General Lee. But now what you need to remember, what's noteworthy with that, is that I said, General Lee, I will meet you at a place of your choosing. Now here we've got the first example of any civil war or any war when a surrender is imminent. The conquering general told the surrendering general, you may choose the place where we will meet. That is there's no exaggerating the magnanimity of that move on my part. Because I could have said, you be here and stay there until I get there. But I chose not to. I'll meet you where you please. And which is just the beginning of the magnanimity that I displayed in what ultimately happened that afternoon. So we went pounding through the Virginia countryside, and as I got to, if you go to Appomattox, and I hope you do, when you stand on the front porch of the McLean house, well, they got 13 steps now. When I was there, they had 7. But when you stand on that front porch and look off to your left, there's that lane that runs in front of the house and curves up a little knoll, barely perceptible increase in altitude, and curves around to the right. At that time, April the 9th of '65, there was a copse of trees there. And Sheridan is standing there beside his horse and some other troopers. And I rode up to him with my 12 fellows, and I got off my horse, Cincinnati, and walked over to Sheridan, and I said, where is he? And Sheridan said, he's right yonder in that house waiting for you. And I said, well, let's be about business and go meet the general. So we trotted down the lane. I went in and met with General Lee. For those who keep track of such matters, we talked for about 78 minutes total. I won't tell you everything about the meeting. I could wax eloquently about that. But as I walked up the front steps, I thought about my appearance. Now, I've got my trousers stuffed in my boots. I got a ragged shirt, waistcoat. I've got a private's blouse, and I'm covered in mud. And I haven't bathed since April the 1st. I absolutely stank. I was so filthy, my hair looked like it was painted on my head. And I thought about my appearance, and see, the first time I met the only time I had met General Lee was back in '46 in Mexico when I had met him. He was essentially the chief of staff for General Winfield Scott, the general-in-chief in the Mexican War. And I was not properly dressed. I'd been on a scouting mission and I had civilian clothes on. And the great Captain Lee, brevet colonel at that time, but the great Captain Lee stopped me and forevermore dressed me down about coming in to see the commanding general not properly attired. And he said, Lieutenant, you will go back to your quarters and you will clean yourself and put on the appropriate uniform. Do you understand me? And I said, absolutely, Captain. Yes, sir. And I went and I bathed and got suited up. And the next time I meet General Lee, and I'm coming up those 7 steps, but we had our talk, and I had the articles written out. Now, something I should like you to know, when we began, first of all, I wrote the surrender terms, 188 words, 188 words. And in my multiple copy order book in pencil, and I showed it to General Lee. He made a correction, of course, and gave it back to me. Ever the General Lee, ever the marble man. And he gave it back to me, and I gave it to Ted Bowers. Now, he's the fellow who said I looked like I could put my head through a brick wall and was about to do it, Ted Bowers. And he was the secretary to write the terms. So I gave it to him, and he couldn't hold the pen staff. He knew what he was going to copy in ink, and he could not write. He messed up one sheet of paper, he had a second sheet of paper, the third sheet of paper that he crumpled up. I was starting to look over at him from my chair, and he said, General, I cannot write this. My hands are shaking too badly. And I said, well, give it to Ely Parker. Now that's Ely, he spells it E-L-Y. He pronounces it Ely. Now he told me, General, if it was E-L-I, it would be pronounced Eli. But he pronounces it Ely, like Robert E. Lee. Full-blooded Seneca Indian chief, lawyer, engineer, and I got him on my staff. I'd met him in Galena that year I lived there before the war. And he has a fine hand, so I said, let him write it. Well, he started to write it, and he came over to me and he said, leaned over and said, General, we don't have any ink. And I turned to General Lee and I said, we don't have any ink. And he said, we do. And Colonel Marshall, his aide, pulls out of his possibles bag, his officer's kit, pulls out a rosewood traveling inkwell and produced it. Well, Ely Parker writes out those 188 words, and I showed it to General Lee, and he approved it, put it in an envelope, put a seal on it, and I gave it to General Lee. Now, it's significant. Think about this. I folded it 3 times, put it in an envelope, and sealed it, the terms of surrender, and gave them to General Lee. He opened the seal, pulled it out, looked at the paper, and nodded and said yes, folded it up and put it back. That formality of actually sealing and delivering the terms to him. He was to write his acceptance, 55 words, 215 words essentially ended the war. Well, he started to write his acceptance, and he looked at Colonel Marshall, and Colonel Marshall said, "We don't have any paper." And I said, "We do." So I gave General Lee a piece of paper, and he wrote, or Colonel Marshall wrote his acceptance, and General Lee signed it. So what I want you to remember there is the terms of surrender and the acceptance that from General Lee to myself were written with federal ink, Confederate ink on federal paper. That's the ultimate coming together, isn't it? Well, we parted ways. I went back to my camp, and Lee went back to his camp. The next morning, on April the 10th, I decided I want to go out and see General Lee and see if I can't persuade him to convince all Confederate armies to surrender, because he had been made General-in-Chief. Went out and visited with him. He demurred, said, "I can't do that. I need to talk to my president," and so forth. And I said, "Yes, I understand. I saw if Robert E. Lee's made up his mind, you're not going to change it." So we parted company. I went back to City Point and then went up to Washington City, and I met with President Lincoln. And then President Lincoln on the 14th was going to go to the theater. Between my getting back on the 13th and the next night, the 14th, I had gotten a note from Sherman, who's down in Raleigh, North Carolina. And he's negotiated a treaty with Joe Johnston, Joseph Eggleston Johnston. And he says, "I'm going to give him the same terms you gave Lee." Now, my terms that I gave Lee, you may not recall. I'll refresh your memory. We just said, we'll sign the rolls, take the pledge, go home. And if a Confederate soldier says, "I own this horse or mule," he may take him with him. No challenge to that. And I said the last sentence of that 188 words, if the officers and men of the Army of Northern Virginia are to go home and stay home, not take up arms against the United States, and obey the laws where they reside, they will not be disturbed by the United States government. Now think about that. The last sentence, nobody went to prison, nobody was hanged. Go home and obey the law where you live, and don't take up arms again against the United States, and you will not be disturbed. They were all sent home. It's the only civil war in military history, I search your military history, where the losing side simply went home. And the Confederate troops were astonished. There were still about 26,000 of them. Well, the president accepted that, Congress accepted it, and Sherman had heard about it, and he said, "I'm going to give Joe Johnston," which was another 50,000 significant Confederate army still in the field. He said, "I'm going to give him the same terms you gave Lee." Wonderful. Well, on the 19th of April, Major Hitchcock comes in to my office, and he gives me the dispatch from General Sherman of the treaty that he and Joe Johnston had agreed on. And I pulled it up, of course, and read it. Oh no, I had palpitations of the heart. What he had done, apparently Joe Johnston hornswoggled him, because the agreement that he had made with Joe Johnston, and I've told you my terms with Lee, as simplistic as they were, and I stressed 188 words. When I wrote that, I practiced the utmost example of verbal economy, because I knew that there were going to be lawyers and trading politicians unto the last day that were going to be saying, "Well, what he really meant here, well, you know, this can be interpreted." No, sir. No, sir. If you read those 188 words, there is no doubt specifically what they mean. There is no other interpretation possible. If you wring it out, you still can't get another interpretation. And Sherman told me he was going to do the same thing, but what I got from Sherman that night was that Joe Johnston had got him to agree to the Confederate soldiers were all going to march back to their home states, stack their arms in the state arsenal. The states, the legislatures of the seceded states, the so-called Confederacy, were going to remain in place. So you've got a Confederate government still in place. All the courts were going to remain the same. All the property laws were going to remain intact. So what that reads easily is all the slaves involved are still going to be slaves. It was, he gave away the farm and the battlefield with it. And I said, this will never do. I sent a messenger to Secretary of War Stanton, and I sent him the treaty that Sherman was proposing. And I said, I think we need to get with the president this night and a cabinet meeting tonight to discuss this. And they called a meeting. We didn't meet till about 8 or 9 o'clock. And they were, as they say on the farm, topping the timber when they read what Sherman had said, what he proposed that we agree to. It's like the Civil War was never fought. Everything's going to be the same as it was before Sumter was fired on in the Confederate States, or with that army that Johnston had. And they were calling him traitor and excoriating him, and I said, they wanted to send a delegation. They wanted to send a delegation to pretty much hang him, but I said, let me go. So on the 21st, I took the cars to the eastern seaboard, took a ship down to Wilmington, North Carolina, and took the cars to Raleigh. And I went, no announcement. I wrote Julia a letter, said I'm on temporary duty, and I can't tell you where I'm going, but I'll be back soon. Met Sherman at night, sent for him. Well, I went to his headquarters, dark of night, and I told him what had happened. And he'd been seeing the headlines too. In fact, he'd taken a stack of newspapers to Joe Johnston and said, we're going to have to do this again. You can see the tone in the newspapers in the North. And so he was expecting me. Now, what he wasn't expecting was for Edwin Stanton to and Andrew Johnson to release statements to the newspapers that Sherman's a traitor. The headlines were blaring, Sherman the traitor, Sherman the devil himself in a federal uniform. And Sherman never forgave either one of them, neither did I for that matter, that they branded him a traitor in the public. So Sherman then renegotiated the same treaty that I had given Robert E. Lee. Now, as time went by, in the next few days, essentially, the other remaining Confederate forces in the field surrendered. April the 26th, I think it was, that Joe Johnston signed a treaty with Sherman, same thing I'd given Lee. May the 26th, Edmund Kirby Smith over in the Trans-Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, Arizona, Oklahoma. Edmund Kirby Smith surrendered the Army of the Trans-Mississippi. And on June the 23rd, the afternoon of June 23rd, Stan Wattie, ever heard that name? Look him up, W-A-T-I-E, you have a charge. Full-blooded Cherokee Indian chief, brigadier general in the Confederate States Army, and he led a contingent of Cherokee Indians, very well-respected combat troops throughout the war, against the Federals, and there were several Indian tribes that sided with the Federals. The Cherokees did not forget what Andrew Jackson had done to them with that Trail of Tears debacle, so they fought for the Confederacy. But on the afternoon of June 23rd of '65, Stan Wattie, General Stan Wattie, in Dokesville, Oklahoma, surrendered the last active combat Confederate force in the field, and the war was over. Not quite. Out in the North Pacific, there was a Confederate raider titled the Shenandoah. There was the Shenandoah, the Alabama, the Florida, I think the Oglethorpe. There were 7 of them. Trying to name all of them is like trying to name the 7 dwarfs in that fairy tale. I never get them all at one time. But the Shenandoah was essentially the last one. And she was out in the North Pacific and attacking commerce and trade and sinking and burning everything they came across. The Confederate Navy, such as it was, perhaps you do not know this, was single-handedly responsible for completely extinguishing an industry and starting another. Because until the Civil War and the Confederate raiders burning and sinking whaling ships, the world, and I mean the world, that sounds so grandiose to say the world, but actually around the globe, at night, people lit their homes with whale oil lamps. They burned brightly, they burned long, and very little smoke. Well, the Confederate raiders stopped all that. They were sinking and burning every whaler that they could find. They completely killed the whaling industry. There's a fellow up in Pennsylvania named Rockefeller, yeah, him. And he's got these oil pumps, oil wells, and he's making lubricants and greases and things that these steam engines that we run the world on need. One of his supervisors, when it became known about the shortage, the non-existence of whale oil to burn in lamps, one of his supervisors went to him and said, you know, Mr. Rockefeller, that kerosene that we're letting run down the hillside into the river, you can burn that in a lamp. And Rockefeller said, you know, he tipped that straw hat back, I understand. He said, you know, I guess we can, can't we? So what they've been allowed to run off as an undesirable byproduct, they started selling in barrels as kerosene to light your homes at night. So that's a direct result, kerosene lamps, of the Confederate Navy sinking whale oil ships. But now the Shenandoah was out there, and they captured one vessel, and the captain is saying, wait, no, Captain Waddell, James Waddell, no, the war is over. The war is over, Captain. He said, yes, of course it is. He burned the vessel, put the survivors, nobody was set to sea, but he made sure the survivors were all right, or they'd take them to the next port. He stopped another ship days later, and they said, no, Captain, the war is over. He said, I don't think so. Well, the third time that they got a ship, the captain is saying, the war is over, Captain Waddell. Look, here's a newspaper with a headline. And Waddell reads it, and he had one of the most famous oh no moments in history. Because I think the war had been over some 66 days by the time he found out about it. Well, now, all those ships that he's been sinking and burning, after the war is over, makes him what? A pirate. A pirate. And you can't say, I didn't know the war was over. And if you tried to say that, those two captains would have said, I told him the war was over as my ship is sinking. So what they had to do was they dumped all the cannon overboard. They took down the flag. They took everything of any military, even the appearance of military, threw it overboard, and they began to sail to England because they knew they couldn't go to an American port. So they went up through the Arctic Circle and down through the North Sea and into Liverpool to Laird and Sons, which had built her, and sailed in. And on November the 6th of 1865 was the last gasp of the Confederacy went silent. Everything went dark. Now they sailed in. Now you should also know, Charles Francis Adams, nephew of John Adams and son of John Quincy Adams, two presidents, Charles Francis Adams was our ambassador over there. And he got word that this rebel raider had slipped in overnight and was docked at Laird and Sons. Well, he contacted the British authorities and sent all kinds of people running down to the docks, going to lock them all up, going to hang those traitors. And you know, it was a ghost ship. Not a sailor to be seen. She's sitting there in dock at anchor and not a sailor in sight. Every one of them got away. Now, Charles Francis Adams accused the Lord Bulwer Lytton over there, the prime minister. He said, you aided them, you abetted them. He said, no, I know nothing of what you speak. I don't know anything about that, but I do know this ship, so-called Shenandoah, lies at anchor here in her berth. You may do with her as you will. And yes, I see. I've just been told my time has about run out. But that's a good gesture at this particular time, because I've told you about after the war. I should like, if you have any questions, to entertain any questions that you may have. And if you ask, you don't have to, but I'll answer any questions you have, and I will repeat the question. Who would ask me anything? I see you, and then you. Yes, sir.
One of the stories of the surrender was that Custer made off with the table that was in the room, and that he galloped out with the table. General, do you remember if that's true, and if so, any idea what happened to the table?
It is true, and I do know what happened with the table. Well, Mr. McLean, William McLean, you've all heard the romance that he had a farm at Bull Run, and they fought the Battle of Bull Run and tore up his farm. And he got disgusted and said, I'm going to move where the war will never touch me, and he moved to Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. So the old thing about the war started on his property and ended in his parlor, that's true. It's not much of a stretch. So he didn't want the surrender in his parlor because he knew what was going to happen with the table and everything else in the room. He tried to steer them to an empty tavern, and Orville Babcock, and Colonel Marshall, my fellow, and Lee's fellow said, this will not do. There's not even any furniture, and there's been nothing here but rats for weeks. So they looked at McLean's house, and he said, that'll do. And so McLean all the time saying, no, they walked up those steps, and they said, we'll meet here. When I left, well, first of all, I'll tell you about Custer. When you look at pictures of the signing of the writing of the treaty and General Lee and myself, none of them are accurate. None of them are entirely wrong. The room, that actual parlor, is 16 feet 9 inches by 16 feet. There is no way that you could shoehorn all the men in that room that you see in these paintings. Now, what we did was, when I went in the room, I had John Rawlins, my chief of staff, and I had Ely Parker with me and Ted Bowers with me, and Sheridan went in with me because he was immediately with me. When General Lee came in, we were working together, he was sitting there waiting for me, we were working together, and as we were talking back and forth, my officers were rotating out. So everybody could spend a few minutes in the room while we were in the room talking. So every officer that was there, not just my staff, every officer that was there spent a few minutes in the room, and then they would go back out. Custer never got in the room. He was in the front yard where he belonged. Right before that, I found out later, Pete Longstreet, who was my best friend, I hugged him in the yard the next day when I saw him, and we went and played a game of brag and talked about old times. He was one of the fellows that stood up for me when I married Julia. There's a legend, he was my best man. He was not. Nobody had a best man in weddings then, but Longstreet and David Pratt and I think of the other fellow, three men stood up with me who became Confederate generals at my wedding. But in talking with Longstreet, he said, you know, that Custer fella came up to me on the morning of the 9th and rode up to me with his cavalry, and they thundered up and they came to me under a flag of truce, and that little bandy rooster walked up to me, and Pete Longstreet's about 6'2" or 6'3", and must weigh close to 300 pounds. He's a very, not fat, he's a very stout, big man. And again now, this is in a world with 5 feet 6 inch men, so he's a giant of a man. And Custer was close to 6 feet tall. But he walks up to Longstreet and said, I demand you surrender to me immediately or I will pitch into you. And Longstreet's looking him up and down. And he took that cigar out of his mouth and he said, pitch in all you like. The blood will be yours. Now get out of here before I turn you over my knee and spank you. And Custer, he exited, he left. Now Custer never told me that, but Pete did. And I tend to believe what Pete Longstreet told me. But Custer never made it in the room. Now as the officers were rudely stripping out the room, Sheridan went over and grabbed the table, and it's about, I guess 30 inches by maybe 18, spool legs and a little drawer that pulls out. And he grabbed it, and Wilbur McLean is standing there watching his room just stripped. And Sheridan pulled out a $20, I think he said a $20 bill. And he said, here's $20 for your table. And McLean swelled up and he said, I don't want your damn Yankee money. And he said, well, you'll have it anyway, and threw it on the floor. He walks outside in the yard and there's Custer, and he gave it to Custer. He said, this is for your service in the war. He really thought a lot of Custer. And Custer took it and rode off with it. He took it back to New York City where his wife Livy kept it in a fireproof warehouse. And it stayed there, I'll slip time a bit here, it stayed in the family until Livy Custer died, I think in the 20s or 30s, and she had willed it to the Smithsonian Institute. So that's where it is. Now, the table that General Lee used was a bigger table, about 4 feet by 3 feet, marble top on oak. And General Ord got that table, and he had 3 soldiers carry it out and carried it off. It wound up, it is presently in the Chicago Historical Society, I think it's in one of their historical rooms in downtown Chicago. But the chair that I sat in, the little swivel leather chair, and the table, and the cane bottom high back chair that General Lee used, all 3 came back to the Smithsonian, and you may see them there, even unto today. You're welcome. Yes, ma'am. And then you. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned earlier that in 48 hours, 9 messages were exchanged. How did these messages get exchanged, and how were the people transmitting the messages protected?
I mentioned that in 48 hours, from 5 o'clock on April the 7th until 9 o'clock on April the 9th, we exchanged 9 messages. How were they sent and what happened? Well, as I said earlier, we don't stock surrender flags in our quartermaster wares. So there had to be a white flag found. Actually, it turned out it was a rag, a towel, about 18 inches by about 20, and it was filthy, but it was the whitest thing we could find. Seth Williams on my staff, my adjutant general, and 2 troopers went with him. Now it's still daylight, but early dusk is settling in. And Seth Williams rides to our federal lines, and several hundred yards away across an open field are Confederates in their lines. So Seth rides out waving that flag of truce, and one of those Confederate riflemen shot one of his men and shot him off a horse. And so they pull back. And they went further down the lines and tried to go across again. This time they went across, but the Confederate sergeant and a couple of men came out, and one of our federal troopers shot and killed. So one of our federal troopers has been killed. One of their troopers has been killed, because now you've got 100,000 men there, 75, 80,000 men looking at 26,000. These are men who have been fighting, many of them for 4 years. They are inured to killing. They don't mind killing you. Also, the men with Robert E. Lee are the stalwarts. They are the men who have held to the end. They've seen desertions every night. Lee was losing a regiment a day to desertions. But these 26,000 men are the men who have fought to the bitter last moment. So they got no problem with killing Yankees. So everybody is very edgy. Get falling daylight, you can't really see what they're doing, and they're waving something. Well, don't know what that is. Better to shoot first and ask what they're doing later, and that's what happened on both sides. Finally, they would yell and say, "Don't shoot, don't shoot. We have a message for General Lee." And they went out and got the message to him, and then repeat that process back and forth. And that happened 7 times. So, but 2 men died, and 2 men died, and 4 men were wounded in the initial exchanges of trying to start that process. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you, General, for winning a great victory for the Union that escaped so many of your predecessors. I'm wondering how you selected General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain to actually take the surrender.
Why did I select Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain to take the surrender from the Confederates, which took place on the 12th to 13th? Well, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is one of the 2 men that I gave a field promotion. Before I left Washington City back in March of '64, they had the Secretary of War and the President had given me authorization to make field promotions. I did that twice. One was to Emory Upton, and at the Mule Shoe during the battles of Spotsylvania, back May the 8th through the 18th of '64. And he was badly wounded, and I promoted him. And then during the Petersburg siege, a few weeks later, I was brought word that in one of the assaults on the Petersburg lines that Colonel Chamberlain had been shot, and he was hit in the groin, and a very painful wound. He had to use a metal catheter for the rest of his life. And he lived until 1913. But that goes back to my point. My staff came to me and said, "General Grant, Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, who had established quite a reputation for himself from Little Round Top, is mortally wounded. And it would mean everything to the colonel if he knew before he died that he had been promoted to brigadier general. Would you do that?" And I said, "Well, that's a mighty fine idea. Give me pencil and paper." And I promoted Joshua Chamberlain to the rank of general and said, "Hurry before he dies." And he had the bad taste to live. He had distinguished himself. He was well worthy of the promotion, but he's one of 2, and I had promoted him for that. And as I said, he suffered mightily from that wound the rest of his life. Now, he died in the winter, to slip time a bit. He did not go to the 50th anniversary of Gettysburg because he was too ill, and he died shortly after, I think in the fall of 1913. And he said that he died of that wound. I'm not so sure about dying of the wound 50 years after he got it, and he was I think 80 or so when he died. Maybe there might have been some other contributing factors to his demise, but he became a distinguished governor of Maine 4 times, became the president of Bowdoin College, and that's how they pronounce it, Bowdoin. It looks like it's Bowdoin, B-O-W-D-O-I-N, but they pronounced it very proudly, Bowdoin. And he taught every class at Bowdoin except, I think it was mathematics. It wasn't that he wasn't capable of that, but he taught every class at that college, which still is an active and distinguished college, and was its president for many years. But and when the surrender came up, I selected him for that place of honor because he was still suffering. He was not recovered from his wound. He never really totally recovered. And I selected him to receive the surrender. And the anecdote about him having the soldiers come to present arms and General Gordon touching his boot tip with his sword, I believe that to be true. Now, there are some folks who dispute that, but even if it's not true, it's a wonderful story. And let's embrace that, knowing that maybe it's not true, but it probably is. Now, who else has a question of me? Yes, sir, in the back, and then you, and then Steve, I think. You're what, third? Yes, sir. Chad. I like the annotated personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. Now, I take a solemn oath with you this night, my friends in history. I will never, ever write a book, and I will never run for office. But if I were to write a book, the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library at Mississippi State University edited the Grant memoirs. And they worked on it for about 5 years. And they have identified every person, place, or thing that is mentioned in the memoirs. It's very readable. You get as much annotation, explanation, as you do memoirs. And when you can read, it's like, I guess to give you a modern example, it's like watching a 3D movie without the glasses and then you put on the glasses. Well, reading his memoirs, just to read them and then read the annotated memoirs is that much difference because everybody, every place, everything is identified. And it's not burdensome, it's easily read. You can pick up, read a few pages and put it down. The personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, annotated by Yale, Harvard publishes it by the U.S. Grant Presidential Library. I also recommend Ronald White, American Ulysses, and Ron Chernow's book, Grant. And the difference between the two books, there's a different style. Both are excellent books, but there's a different style. Ron Chernow, and I've had the pleasure of meeting both of these men and talking with them at some length. And Ron Chernow, who is a distinguished writer, Hamilton, Washington, he's got one out now. Steve, Mark Twain. If Ron Chernow wrote it, it's good. It's weighty and it's long, but it's good. And but Chernow will tell you very quickly, I'm not a historian, I'm a journalist. And that's the style that he writes. It's very informative, it reads well. Ron White has a PhD in divinity from Yale, and he's an ordained minister. And he writes a much more humanistic version. He doesn't remove the warts and put Band-Aids on the scars by any means. But Ron White's American Ulysses is a more humane side of Grant and everyone that he comes in contact with. But I highly recommend Grant by Chernow, American Ulysses by Ron White, and I'm sure they've got, where are you, Andrew? I'm sure you've got both those books, don't you? And if you don't have the annotated memoir, you have a copy? I'm sure you'll have one soon. There's going to be a demand for several copies of the annotated memoirs. I had a second question here. Yes, sir. What's your question?
Yes, General Grant. During the war, you had a reputation for obtaining unconditional surrender from your opponents. Do you feel that this reputation was undeserved, and how would you also, or deserved, and how would you also characterize the surrender that you obtained from General, the conditional or an unconditional surrender?
Well, the question is, you got the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. Are you really Unconditional Surrender Grant? No. That's an unfair moniker that journalists have seen fit to pin upon me. Now, I'm the only American general in history to ever take the surrender of 3 complete armies, and I did it in the same war. No one else before or after has done that. The first surrender, Simon Bolivar Buckner, longtime friend of mine, 3 years with him at the academy, was in command at Fort Donelson, and he surrendered to me. And when I unexpectedly, about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning on February the 16th, I got a note. Charles Ferguson Smith came into me. He was a general under my command. He had been Captain Smith when I went to the academy. I was 5'1" and I weighed 117 pounds. I'm in the administrative offices of the United States Military Academy, and I did not want to be there. And I walked in, and Captain Smith stands up, and he unfolded like a carpenter's rule. He was 6'4" and weighed about 100 pounds. And he said, "Ah, yes, Mr. Grant, good to see you. Ulysses S, got you right here, Ulysses." I said, "Actually, that's not my name. Now, my name's Another Evening." But he whipped up that piece of paper and pointed that long 44 caliber finger at that paper, and he's looking down at me, and I will spare you the volume and the histrionics that Captain Smith did not spare me. And he said, "Mr. Grant, the United States Army says your name is Ulysses S. Grant. And Ulysses S. Grant, by God, you are. Now, if your parents want to call you Hiram, they can go down to the courthouse and change your name, but the Army says you're Ulysses S. Grant. Do I make myself clear?" And I said, "Abundantly," and I left. I thought, well, I'll get that changed before I graduate, which I didn't anticipate happening. But I didn't get it changed, and it stayed. Now, when I got to Fort Donelson in February '62, I'm sitting there in front of the Wood of Crisp house. There was a little fireplace, and you have to understand the situation with the geometry. I'm in a straight back cane bottom chair sitting beside a little tiny fireplace. It's 10 below zero outside. And General Smith, Captain Smith is now General Smith under my command. And I had a real problem with that. And I told him, I just can't bring myself to give you orders. And he said, "Grant," barked at me, "I'm a soldier and I understand this situation. You give me the orders you see fit. Don't worry about our past lives or acquaintance." Well, General Smith comes in and said, "General Grant, got a message from you from the rebels." And I said, well, I'm looking at him, "What is it?" He said, "They want commissioners to talk about surrender." He thrust a paper at me, and I took it from him, and I looked at it, and I said, "What do you think about this, General?" And he said, "Bah, no terms for the damned rebels, but unconditional." I said, "That sounds good. Bring me pencil and paper." And that's where it came from. I do not claim unconditional. Now, the journalists hung that on me with the initials U.S. Grant. So that it was unconditional. But keep in mind, the war was only 10 months old. Only 10 months. There had been some battles fought, a few, very few, but it was only 10 months old. Nobody had ever taken an entire army. I took 17,000 men captive. And it was like the dog chasing the wagon, and he finally caught it. What do you do with it? What do I do with it now? So my feeling was the best thing to do, the only thing to do, was unconditional surrender. We're not going to negotiate, we're not going to quibble. And is my time growing short?
Yeah, we can't negotiate on that either.
Okay. Well, the surrender at Vicksburg was anything but unconditional. The surrender at Appomattox, I've already told you, was anything but unconditional. So that concludes it. Chad, you're so diplomatic.
We have one last thing for you.
Ah,
On behalf of Friends of the Library, thank you.
all right, thank you. I'm so richly blessed. Now, before you go, you have a charge. You filled a room here tonight to hear a speaker that you didn't know anything about. You have to do three things. You have to keep reading. Read, and then read everything that cannot outrun you. Support this library. You should be here filling a seat every time light shows through a door. Do you understand me? And support the Cleveland Civil War Roundtable, because they're the ones responsible for me being here, and they keep much of our history alive for your community. So you have your orders. Be careful going home.